Hi, welcome to the Amazing Grace Bible class. I'm Steve Flatt, the teacher of the class, and today you're joining us for a very special episode of Amazing Grace. If you were viewing last week, you know that we launched into a two-part series that documents a trip I made with 56 other folk to the nation of Israel last April. Last week we looked at scenes from Athens, Greece as we made our way over. And then we saw shots from Tel Aviv, Joppa, Mount Carmel, Caesarea, and all kinds of other magnificent places. Well, today the journey continues, and I want you to view for the next 30 minutes and be inspired as we were by what we saw from the Holy Land. We left you last week at the spring of Harod, where Gideon assembled his troops for the battle with the Midianites. From that spring, we made our way to the ancient ruins of Beth Shean, or Beit Shan, and there we found one of the most marvelous archaeological discoveries of the last century. We're on location at one of the most historic sites in all Israel. This is the site of Beit Shan. That's the Hebrew pronunciation. We sometimes call it Beth Shean. It's also the site of a Roman city called Scythopolis. And let's talk about the Roman city of Scythopolis first, because the ruins that have been uncovered are absolutely unbelievable. Scythopolis thrived between the 2nd and the 5th century A.D. I'm standing on the steps of one of the most beautiful theaters in all the ancient world. The stage is down below me. This theater would hold over 5,000 people. The acoustics here are absolutely perfect. In the background, you see a temple that was constructed in just the foundation stones and a few columns to the god Dionysius, the Greek and Roman god of wine. And apparently this city was built to honor him. In the foreground, you can see a beautiful main street that lays practically intact the way it was uncovered, that went right through the middle of Scythopolis and that led to that temple to Dionysius. If you come on around just a little bit farther, you can see one of the largest public bathhouses of the ancient world. The columns behind me there were all holding up the roof, and the false flooring to that bathhouse, that was a magnificent structure at one point in time. But then going beyond Scythopolis, back farther in history, if you look at the large hill in the background, that's called a tell. That is the tell of Beth Shan. Beth Shan has roots all the way back to the Egyptians and the Canaanites, many hundreds of years BC. It was also the city that was in existence about 1100 to 1000 BC when King Saul was on the throne, and when he was defeated in battle and ultimately fell on his own sword. His body was taken to Beth Shan, and up there high on that hill, on what would have been the city walls, that body was put on display in an attempt to humiliate the fallen Israelite leader. From Beth Shan, we made our way to Jericho, the oldest city on the face of the earth. We hit Jericho during a heat wave, even for the month of April. When we arrived, it was about 105 degrees. So before we made our way up to the archaeological digs, we stopped to have some refreshments. And while we were there, we enjoyed a little bit of fun riding some camels. After the camel rides, we made our way up to the excavation sites. When you hear the word Jericho, you probably, like I, think of that scene in Joshua chapter 6, when the children of Israel had entered the promised land. And the first city that they had to face and conquer was the city of Jericho, well known for its fortified wall. Well, using God's battle plan, circling the city once a day for 6 days, and then 7 times on the 7th day, And then all the people letting out this huge shout, God caused that wall to fall, and Israel took over Jericho and began their conquest of the Promised Land. Directly behind me are the ruins of the ancient city of Jericho, the oldest city of the world. Carbon-14 testing has indicated that some of the wall structure deep below goes back to the year 8000 BC, which would make Jericho the oldest inhabited city known in civilization. Back behind this ancient city of Jericho, there is a large mountain that is the traditional site of the Mount of Temptation, that site that we read about in Matthew chapter 4, where Satan would have tempted Jesus to turn the stones into bread or to throw himself off the pinnacle of the temple, and then to show him the kingdoms of the world that could be his if Jesus would bow down and worship him. Of course, we really don't have any idea where that was or how that occurred, because it occurred in the spiritual realm. But it's interesting to see that mountain in the ancient city of Jericho. From the ruins of Jericho, we made our way along the old Jericho road going up to Jerusalem. Jericho is just a few miles from Jerusalem, but the road between the two is the steepest ascent of any road in the world. We're just a few hundred feet off the Jericho road that leads from Jericho to the ancient city of Jerusalem. The noise you hear in the background are bells from the monastery way down there in the valley. That monastery is built right on the old Jericho foot trail. And if you look over on the side of the mountain going through there, you can see that footpath that goes back hundreds and hundreds of years. When I see that path winding through these mountains, it reminds me of Luke chapter 10, parable of the Good Samaritan. You remember? When one of the teachers of the law asked Jesus, well, who is my neighbor? And Jesus told that story of the Good Samaritan, about the man who was waylaid by robbers, and the priest and the Levite passed by and didn't help him. But the Samaritan did, and took him on to an inn and cared for him there. You see that stark picture of that foot trail on the side of the mountain. You can picture the man being waylaid by the robbers, and it all comes to life for you. This is one of the most majestic scenes that we've seen in Israel because of the stark desert look of the mountains. Not a very populated area, but a beautiful sight in its own way. In a moment, we'll tell you about our visit to Jerusalem, but first I want to tell you about a side excursion that we took south of the Holy City. We traveled down to the Dead Sea. The Dead Sea is the lowest point on the face of the earth, over 1,300 feet below sea level. Because of its low elevation, it's extremely hot. And it also is a body of water that has such a high salt content that literally nothing lives in the Dead Sea. When you look at it from a distance, it's hard to tell where the sea begins and the sky starts, because the salt is so white that it looks like clouds literally right there on the water. Because of that salt content, it is so buoyant that everybody floats in the sea. It's stark, but it's beautiful in its own way. Rising like a huge mesa overlooking the Dead Sea is Masada. Masada is a fortress that was built by Herod the Great. And near the end of the first century, it was where the Jewish zealots that were led by Eleazar ben Yair held out as the last stronghold against Roman invasion. For 3 years, 967 Jews survived on the top of this desolate plateau. And finally, as they saw that conquest was inevitable, they decided to die as free men rather than as slaves, and committed a mass suicide there. The Romans were shocked when they actually took over the city and found the bodies lying there. Masada is a place that stirs great emotion in the hearts of Jews today. Masada lies about 900 feet above the Dead Sea. You can walk there, but it's advised to take the cable car. And as you go up, you see the magnificent view around you. Once on top, you begin to see the different archaeological discoveries that have been uncovered. For example, you can find a bathhouse and a bakery, different storage rooms where grain was held. And you can imagine life there by the almost 1,000 Jews for that 3-year period of time. As you look around the excavations, you may notice a black line that's drawn in the rock. Everything below that black line was uncovered exactly in that state, and any parts above it have been reconstructed by rocks and other pieces of debris that have found in the ruins. Also, Masada is the oldest synagogue in the world. Making our way back toward Jerusalem from the Dead Sea area, we stopped by Qumran, a fascinating community with a great deal of history. Qumran was the center for the Essenes. The Essenes was a sect of Judaism that was flourishing during the 2nd century BC. What we have around me here is a bit of a retreat center. The Essenes, some of them lived in Jerusalem, were down south near the Dead Sea. They would come here, many of them would live here, and they would do their work. One of their primary facets of work was the recording of Scripture and other literature. In a room directly behind me, it's called the Scriptorium. The Scriptorium was the place where Scripture and other literature would be transcribed. And then around me are cisterns, bedrooms, meeting halls, even a place for their laundry. The Essenes are best known, however, for being the ones who transcribed the Dead Sea Scrolls that were discovered in 1946 in caves that are in front of me, all through the hills here in this very barren wilderness area near the Dead Sea. Now come with me, I want to show you the site of the cave where the most manuscripts were discovered. This is cave number 4. And of the 800 plus major manuscripts that were found that are part of what is called the Dead Sea Scrolls, approximately 500 of them were found in clay jars in that cave. Now there's a fascinating story behind that because that cave is extremely close to the Essene excavations that you looked at just a moment ago. Fascinatingly enough, those excavations were going on for 2 years before they thought to look at that cave, the one that was closest to them. They assumed that because it was so handy and that they probably wouldn't have used it. But when they went inside, they were amazed at what they found. Coming back to Jerusalem from Qumran, we ran across some Bedouins. Bedouins are those nomads who, with their flocks of sheep and goats, continue to roam the desert area. And they live just like they did 2,000–3,000 years ago. We took a moment to photograph some of their flocks, though the Bedouins themselves were rather shy. Oh, and you can see just a few changes from a millennium ago. You can find a tractor every now and then, and even a television antenna. We began our tour of Jerusalem with the Mount of Olives. The Mount of Olives is located on the eastern part of the Holy City, and when you get there, you are in awe at the magnificent view of the old city of Jerusalem. Our guide, Gila, took a few moments to tell us about what we were seeing.
Okay, we're looking now at Jerusalem, and we're on the Mount of Olives, sitting on the eastern part of the city. Directly below us is the Kidron Valley, also called the Valley of Jehoshaphat, the Valley of Judgment. The belief is by both Jews and Muslims, this is according to the prophet Joel, that the dead will arise in the end of days. They'll cross over the Valley of Judgment. They'll go into the temple area and win eternal life. This is the place to be buried because tradition has it, Jewish tradition has it, that the dead are going to rise first here. And if you're not buried here, you have to go through all kinds of underground caverns and roll here. Yeah. Now, in this cemetery, they don't bring flowers because flowers die immediately, right, when you place them. But a stone lasts forever. And so people leave the little rocks behind as a reminder that they were here.
While sitting on the Mount of Olives, we could look down below and see the Kidron Valley. And there in the Kidron Valley is the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus prayed and was arrested just before his crucifixion. As you look over the city from the Mount of Olives, one of the most noticeable features is the Golden Dome. This is the Dome of the Rock. It is the Muslim mosque that was constructed about 600 AD to supposedly commemorate the site where Elijah Muhammad ascended into heaven on his horse. That same spot would have been the place where Solomon's temple was located, and going farther back in history, it is traditionally the site of Mount Moriah, where Abraham would have taken Isaac to have been sacrificed. The Mount of Olives also offers one of the best views of the wall surrounding ancient Jerusalem. And in that wall you can see the Golden Gates, the Gates of Mercy. These were blocked up during the Muslim reign, but it is likely through those gates that Jesus would have entered as he came triumphantly into Jerusalem a week before his crucifixion. As we made our way down the Mount of Olives, we entered into the Garden of Gethsemane. It was crowded at the time we visited, but our guide astutely ushered us into a little area where we had privacy and enjoyed our own devotion. He went away a second time and prayed, "My Father, if it is not possible for this cup to be taken away unless I drink it, may your will be done." When he came back, he again found them sleeping because their eyes were heavy. So he left them and went away once more and prayed the third time, saying the same thing. Then he returned to the disciples and said to them, Are you still sleeping and resting? Look, the hour is near, and the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us go. Here comes my betrayer. After the devotion, we toured the garden, and we saw the oldest olive tree there. Its age would have put it back even to the time when Jesus would have walked there. From the garden, we made our way to the house of Caiaphas, where Jesus would have been taken after his arrest and where his trial would have begun. As we walked inside the house of Caiaphas, we entered into a chamber where it is suspected that Jesus would have been held before appearing before Pontius Pilate. The steps that I'm sitting on right now are steps that have been excavated, and they go back at least 2,200 years. And this was a main sidewalk leading up to Jerusalem from the Kidron Valley. These steps would have been where Jesus would have walked, both going into the Garden of Gethsemane, the Mount of Olives after the Last Supper, and then being led back during his arrest, perhaps to the place that is right beside me, the house of Caiaphas. From the house of Caiaphas, we walked through Jerusalem by the Pool of Bethesda. You might remember in John chapter 5 that was the site where Jesus healed the man who was lame. We made our way to the Antonia Fortress. The Antonia Fortress was built in 36 BC by Herod the Great and named in honor of his friend Mark Antony. Tradition has it that this was the site of the judgment hall, or the praetorium, where Jesus would have been tried before Pilate. Also, this would have been the place where he was held, awaiting those different stages of trial before Pilate. You can see on the floor and also on the walls etchings of some games that Roman soldiers would have played. And you get a sense of what it must have been like having Jesus held prisoner here. We stopped in one of the chambers to read the account of Jesus' appearance before Pilate. They wanted to be able to eat Passover. So Pilate came out to them and asked, What charges are you bringing against this man? If he were not a criminal, they replied, we would not have handed him over to you. Pilate said, Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law. But we have no right to execute anyone, the Jews objected. This happened so that the words Jesus had spoken, indicating the kind of death he was going to die, would be fulfilled. From the Antonia Fortress, we made our way along the Via della Rosa. It's the way of the cross. There are 14 different traditional stations where different things in Jesus' carrying the cross would have taken place. 9 of those stations are actually along the Via della Rosa outside, and the last 5 are in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. As you can see, the way of the cross is now dotted with bazaars and crowded passageways where vendors of every type will try to sell you something. We made our way along until finally we came to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. When you visit Jerusalem, there are 2 different sites where Jesus was presumed to have been crucified and buried. The first and the oldest is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. There has been a church on this site since 325 AD, immediately after the Council of Nicaea. And though that building was destroyed and the one after it destroyed, the present structure has been in place since about the year 1100 AD. Tradition goes all the way back to almost the 2nd century as this being the site where Jesus would have been crucified and where he would have been entombed. At least 6 major world religions recognize this as the authentic site of Jesus' death and burial, and inside you'll find different commemorative shrines to his death, to the place where traditionally he would have been taken down from the cross, and then to the place where he would have been entombed and would have come forth from the grave. Though tradition going back to the 3rd century AD would hold the Holy Sepulchre as being the place where Jesus died and was buried, another site has been uncovered in the late 19th century which also offers evidence as being the place where Jesus might have been crucified and then entombed. It's called the Garden Tomb, and beside it is the place of the skull.
On a hill far away stood an old rugged cross, the emblem of suffering and shame.
I'm standing in front of what is called the Garden Tomb. The Garden Tomb is one of 2 proposed sites where Jesus' body was laid and where it came forth from the grave on that magnificent Sunday morning. This Garden Tomb was discovered by a British officer, Major General Charles George Gordon, in the early 1880s. The Garden Tomb Association was opened in 1884, and now we all have the opportunity to come and visit this magnificent site. Now, quite honestly, we don't know if this is indeed the tomb where Jesus was laid. And at the same time, there are characteristics about it that would point to it being a very real possibility. For one thing, you notice it was hewn out of rock by a man's hand. It also has all of the characteristics of a rich man's tomb. Inside, for example, there is the wailing chamber, and then two different crypt areas where individuals could be laid. Notice too the trench right in front of the door that's hewn there. That trench would have contained a stone, a grist mill-like stone, that would have been rolled in front to seal that entrance. If this is not the tomb where Jesus was, it certainly is one of the most magnificent visual aids that we will ever see. And I can't look at that open door without getting chills down my spine, thinking about Jesus coming forth on that Sunday morning. Can you?
The next day we began our tour of Jerusalem by going to the famous Western Wall.
I'm standing beside the Western Wall of Jerusalem. We in the West sometimes have called it the Wailing Wall. The Western Wall had no particular significance in Jerusalem until the destruction of the temple, at which time, with the destruction of the Holy of Holies, it began to be assumed that the presence of the Almighty literally would inhabit this wall in a special place. This is as far as the Jews can come to the old city, or as close as they can come to the temple itself. And so this is a place of prayer for Jews. I'm in the men's courtyard, and all men are required to have their heads covered to pray here. And the women's courtyard is directly behind me. Pilgrims from all over the world come to this place and put prayer requests in the rock. You can see the little slips of paper, hundreds of thousands of them that are put here daily. And these have names or special prayer requests. It's a very solemn sight, the Western Wall here in Jerusalem.
We traveled through the gate in the Western Wall and came into the Muslim quarter of Old Jerusalem. There we saw the Dome of the Rock, magnificent structure erected in 600 A.D. to commemorate the ascension of Muhammad on his horse into heaven to see Allah. This Dome of the Rock stands where the Temple Mount would have been, the site of Solomon's temple. And today, no Orthodox Jew will go into this particular quarter or region because of its Muslim control. As you can see, the Muslims didn't particularly want us to take pictures there either. After visiting the Dome of the Rock, we came outside the old wall to the southern portion. There was a huge set of steps that at one time led up to the Temple Mount.
I'm on the steps that lead up to the Temple Mount, and just to let us get our bearings, behind me in the distance is the Mount of Olives, and the entrance to the temple would have been behind me as well. In fact, up to the right are what are called the triple gates. Just where they are, and perhaps a little bit on the other side, would have been entrance to the temple area in the time of Jesus. The steps where I'm sitting exactly would have been the exit route. And they were broad, and it was a place where people wouldn't just walk out from the Temple Mount, but they would stay, talk, teaching would occur, and they would mingle for quite a while. Jesus would have undoubtedly taught on these steps, as did the rabbis, and it's not at all unlikely that Peter and the apostles would have used these steps in preaching that sermon that we have recorded in Acts 2 on Pentecost. And speaking of that, there's something very significant right behind me. Behind me are about 60 mikvah pools. The mikvahs were pools that the Jews would use for immersion. They would be filled with rainwater. And it is almost certain that this would have been the site where the 3,000 baptism occurred on that Pentecost day as the church began. It's really the only site in all Jerusalem where that much water could have been collected at one place for 3,000 baptisms.
During our stay in Jerusalem, we stayed at the Mount Zion Hotel, which, by the way, overlooked hell. Well, not literally, but figuratively. The hotel does overlook the Valley of Gehenna, and Gehenna is the word you find used most frequently in the Bible to refer to hell. It got that name because this valley was actually a garbage dump for Old Jerusalem. And there were smoldering heaps of ruin there that were constantly ablaze and that let loose a foul odor, and hence the imagery for hell itself. Not far from our hotel is the traditional site where King David was entombed. We traveled to the upper room, that place where Jesus held the last Passover meal with his disciples before he would go to the Garden of Gethsemane for his betrayal and arrest. While in Jerusalem, we visited the Shrine of the Book. The Shrine of the Book is a museum that houses a number of the pieces of the Dead Sea Scrolls that were found in Qumran. The very shape of the building is designed after one of the pieces of pottery that a Dead Sea Scroll was found in. Not far from Jerusalem is the little town of Bethlehem, the place where Jesus was born. The church that marks that site is the oldest church to exist on a single site anywhere in the world. And down beneath the main floor of that church is the grotto. It would have been a cave, likely, where Jesus was born, with a star commemorating that spot.
But Mary treasured up all these things and pondered them in her heart. The shepherds returned, glorifying and praising God for all the things they had heard and seen, which were just as they had been told.
Well, you've heard me talk about the trip, but why don't you listen to some of the impressions from some of the folk who went with me?
You know, for me it was kind of a simple thing. It was the steps between the upper and the lower city. Because as our guide told us, you know, we know Jesus walked there. We know he was on those steps. And just to know that just kind of makes you feel like I've been where Jesus was, figuratively. Of course, we hope we've been where he was spiritually too. But tremendous feeling came over me, I guess, just to see those steps and to know that he actually walked there. Lots of other places they think he was, but we know he was there.
I don't know of any one thing that stands out foremost in my mind. I guess Jerusalem. I guess just being here where Jesus lived and died, and being in the upper room today, I guess that was the most touching point, besides having to say goodbye to Gila.
I think everything impressed me, and my faith will never be the same. But one thing that really did was about close to the last of the tour, and when we went in that Holy Sepulchre Catholic Church and saw our Christ hanging there, and that just really kept it all, because I realized then how much he suffered and died for all of us. And my faith will never, ever be the same again. It's a wonderful, wonderful trip.
To have increased my faith, to have seen the Bible come alive in a dimension that is not seen just by reading in the pages. Anytime anyone would have an opportunity to make this pilgrimage, I believe it would increase their faith just the same as it's done for me and many, many thousands who have come before me.
Thank you for letting us share our memories with you of the trip we made to Israel last April. It really was an exciting thing to be able to walk where Jesus walked, where the apostles would have stood, and to see places where those great Old Testament characters would have lived. It was also a thrilling thing to be able just to visit another culture, another country, and to see the way people are living there today, and to better understand them and their ways. We left from the experience better people. And I hope that you've benefited from this special edition of the Amazing Grace Bible class. I hope someday you'll have the opportunity to visit this land in person yourself. And I also hope you'll tune in next week for another Amazing Grace class.